Good morning, everybody. We have seats in the front. We'd love for you to sit in the front. Welcome to New York Law School and our City Law Breakfast, our 142nd City Law Breakfast. Let me bring to the podium our Dean and President, Anthony Crowell.
Thanks so much, Ross, and good morning, everyone. How are you today? Good. I want to welcome you to New York Law School this morning. And as we say, and as I always say at these breakfasts, we call ourselves New York's Law School, and there's a good reason for that. We are tremendously honored today to host Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism at the NYPD, John Miller. He has such extraordinary responsibilities to keep this city safe, and we are people who are indebted to him on a daily basis, and I know his remarks today will be one of the most interesting and important sets of remarks that we've heard and hosted here in the history of the City Law Breakfasts over 22 years. And we are particularly proud that New York Law School is able to bring this program to you because, as you know, more than any other law school in the city, we have graduated so many members of the NYPD and brought them into the legal profession and launched new careers for them at PD and beyond, and it's particularly exciting. One person I'd like to recognize who works with Commissioner Miller is Samantha DeLeo here, who is a class of 2013 graduate and works in the legal department and closely with the commissioner. So, Sam, where are you? Thank you. Nice to show. As you know, the NYPD always faces countless challenges in dealing with daily instances of crime, but they're also on the front line protecting our city and really our nation from terrorism. As former counsel to Mayor Bloomberg, I know that the unprecedented work the PD does every day in counterterrorism and intelligence is critical, and I've certainly been impressed with how Commissioner Miller, along with Commissioner Bratton and now Commissioner O'Neill, have further strengthened and refined those efforts. And as if the NYPD's job couldn't get any harder, they now have a daily challenge of guarding the president's home in one of the busiest areas of New York and the corresponding resource and financial issues that go along with that. What's also so remarkable is that regardless of the challenge, NYPD really always rises to the challenge and the occasion and never falls short. So we thank Commissioner Miller for being here, for his service, and really look forward to his remarks. I'll bring Ross back up here to do more formal introductions, but thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Anthony. Let me first say and thank the people who are sponsoring the breakfast, the law firm of Greenberg Traurig, Ed Wallace. Thank you for the long-term support. Consolidated Edison, Senior Vice President Francis Reshevsky here, thank you also. And Verizon, Richard Windrum, I didn't see him, but he has been a wonderful supporter. Also, I'd like to thank our special sponsors, Guidepost and Bart Schwartz, for being a special sponsor and sponsoring this particular breakfast. I want to call to your attention also the gold stars on a number of nameplates because those are people who voluntarily contributed. And I want to show you also our annual report, which was now a year old. We're doing another one will be out in May. Has a name of every person who's ever contributed in the last couple of years to this enterprise, and there's still time. So to get your name in the annual report this year. And thank you all. We could not have these kinds of breakfasts as often as we do without the wonderful financial support. Today we do have really an important talk about the city of New York, and we thank John Miller for being willing to come and address this topic. He is, of course, the Deputy Commissioner for Intelligence and Counterterrorism. He brings to that position very wide experience with high positions in the FBI, in Washington with the agency that prepares the President's daily report, with the Los Angeles Police Department, and in New York City as before. So his career in this area is perhaps unsurpassed. But he has another career, that of a reporter, a very successful reporter with ABC, CBS, radio here, and he reminds me that he was a reporter when I was a commissioner, and I do remember that. But I want to talk about his reporting because he did have one of those amazing moments in 1998 where he got an interview, one of the few interviews, an hour-long interview of Osama bin Laden. This is 1998. He leaves Pakistan, driven over the Khyber Pass into Afghanistan to an unspecified location. Late at night, Osama bin Laden comes in with his assault weapon plucked next to him, and he has an hour-long interview. And if you go on in the internet, you can find endless versions of it, short, long. It's really quite an amazing interview. And think about that, 1998, 3 years before 9/11. But then he also wrote an article in Esquire about it, and I want to quote just one paragraph because I think it's a description, a little bit of description of that interview, but it does tell you a lot about what he saw that day. He says, bin Laden never raises his voice, and to listen to his untranslated answers, one could imagine that he was talking about something that did not much concern him, nonchalant. He does not smile. He continued speaking, looking down at his hands as if he were reading invisible notes. And then the quote, "Your situation with Muslims in Palestine is shameful. If there is any shame left in America, houses were demolished over the heads of children. Also, by the testimony of relief workers in Iraq, the American-led sanctions resulted in the deaths of more than 1 million Iraqi children. All of this is done in the name of American interests. We believe that the biggest thieves in the world and the terrorists are the Americans. The only way for us to fend off these assaults is to use similar means." And then Osama bin Laden continues, "We do not worry about American opinion or the fact that they place prices on our heads. We, as Muslims, believe our fate is set." That's what John wrote in 1999 after the interview. We bring him to the podium to hear what he has to say today in his new role, not as a reporter, but as a person charged with the responsibility of counterterrorism and intelligence.
Good morning, and thank you, Commissioner. The bin Laden interview was kind of a singular experience in that you're talking to a guy for an hour who they're not translating the answers for, and you're going down a list of questions. And, you know, what Ross read from is what bin Laden said, but at the time I had a television problem, which was, I guess they didn't tell bin Laden, we're not going to translate this. So I would ask the question, the translator would repeat the question, bin Laden would then, at great length, answer the question to the translator. So I was about to come back with an hour-long television interview with a guy who's looking over here. So I asked myself, what would Barbara Walters do? And then it came to me, which is you connect with the interview subject. So I began to look into his eyes directly. I took him away from the translator and I began to nod as if I understood. And for the next hour, I would ask questions, he would talk, and I would... At the end, I went back to our translator, who they kept in the back of the room, and I said, all right, so those were very long answers, but did he actually answer the questions? He said, I don't know if he answered the questions, but we need to get the tapes and we need to get out. I'm like, well, what could you hear? He said he declared war in America. He predicted a black day for America after which nothing would be the same. And he said this was going to start very soon, and that the Americans were the great thieves and the terrible people. And I said, Tariq, when he was saying this, what was I doing? He said, you were nodding in agreement. It wasn't the best interview I ever did. It was just the best known, and there's a difference. But if you cycle back and think, all right, so what did we talk about that night? I asked him, did you bomb the World Trade Center in 1993? Were you responsible for Ramzi Youssef's plot to blow up airliners over Pacific routes, potentially killing thousands of people? Was it your plot to kill the Pope in Manila? Did you plan to kill President Clinton? Mostly the same stuff you ask anyone in a foreign country when you first meet them in their cave. He, on the other hand, I think had a kind of a scripted list of things he needed to get through. One was declaring war on the United States. One was talking about Al-Qaeda and its developing network. And if you actually kind of step back from that interview, it's about 7 or 8 pages of transcript. It's in the public record in a couple of trials now. What I asked him was, are you worried about being captured or killed by the Americans? And he said, it doesn't matter what the Americans do if I'm captured or killed. What he was saying is, Al-Qaeda isn't about one person. It's about an organization. And he went on to say, it's not about an organization as we go forward, because we just met with all the other organizations in a big conclave in Pakistan, and we have set aside our differences to focus on the main enemy, and that, this would become not just an organization, not just a man, but an organization with a network. And if you took the people around bin Laden at the time, people like Mustafa Setmari and Nasser, known as al-Suri or the Syrian, they were pushing the idea that if they did this right, the organization could spawn the network, and the network could spawn the movement that didn't require an organization or even a network, just a message. Now fast forward past the embassy bombings that happened 7.5 weeks after bin Laden and I met in Afghanistan, past the USS Cole bombing, past the horrific events down the street here of 9/11, and say, let's take a look at bin Laden's forecast of where things would go and see how history treated that. And I think what we're seeing today in terms of globalization, which is great, globalization is the thing that brings us together with somebody we might never meet in our lives on the other side of the world. It's the thing that takes a small business and makes it big. It's the thing that connects people and cultures and countries. But it's also the thing that terrorist groups, organized crime groups, and others have exploited to expand their own portfolios. And if you look right now, God bless you, Judy, much of terrorism is actually being driven by the globalization, the clever use of social media, and the fact that the world is becoming a very small place. Today's terrorist may be an operator who was trained in a camp, sent out with the manager of a small cell, who would execute a terrible plot like the Paris attacks from November with a series of restaurants, a soccer stadium, the Bataclan Theater. But the terrorist is much more likely, statistically, to be somebody who's never met the terrorist group, never been in the terrorist camp, never had any formal training, but has received the message. The thing that bin Laden told us how many years ago was the ultimate goal, and is self-driving. So what I'd like to do today is, we don't pretend to have all the answers. We pretend to have some ideas and some thoughts. So I'd like to frame some of those ideas about where we see this going. It is great being the Deputy Commissioner for Counterterrorism and Intelligence. It's also the only way that you're going to hear my name and the word intelligence together in the same sentence a lot. So now that that's actually a part of my Google search, I think it's improving. But let's take a look at, we'll start on the news. So yesterday is Paris. This is a function of the NYPD, where an attack in Paris is like an attack in New York for us. I was in the elevator on the way down to the police garage to get in my car. The phone rings. Our people are saying, we're getting reports of shots fired on the Champs-Élysées. That causes a number of synapses to fire now quite naturally, based on programs that have been built over years. One is, get on the phone to our man in Paris. Our man in Paris is a sergeant, a detective sergeant, who started here in the 1st Precinct, who is now the NYPD's police liaison to the prefect of police in Paris, who is, in their operations center during this event and plugged in. And we're getting real-time information because we need to know several things. Is it a robbery gone bad on the street in front of a jewelry store? That could be, and it wouldn't affect us. Is it a terrorist attack in progress on the Champs-Élysées, which would be the equivalent of our Broadway or Fifth Avenue? And do we need to move resources to those places? Was the Turkish Airlines office that seems to be at that address part of the target, or was it just there, like the place next door? So all of these questions swirl. In the meantime, we also know the first version of the story is never right. We know the second version of the story is never right. So we start to say, well, let's go for a worst-case scenario. Push more resources into Times Square where we already had counterterrorism resources. Push more resources towards the Turkish mission to the United Nations, the Turkish Consul General, Turkish Airlines, to see if that was part of the target set. Let's make sure we double down on that here. That is kind of the new normal in New York City, which is we react in real time as an effect of globalization, but also as an effect of our understanding that in many ways New York is the capital of the world. We move in real time towards those things while they're happening. The other thing is, as part of that same spectrum, we also scan across all social media to say, who's claiming responsibility? Is it a real claim? What other data is out there from just regular people? And, you know, we see actual video of the shooting emerge on social media where you can kind of see in the background, here's a guy in a car across the street, but you can see the confrontation unfolding behind that police van. That police van was part of their Sentinel program, which is the equivalent to our relatively new Critical Response Command, or our CRC team. So one of the other things we did was flash out to CRC, the group of police officers that was targeted and attacked, perform the same function as you do. So make sure, you know, I know you're paying attention every day, but make sure that you're not just paying attention to the target you're guarding, pay attention to who's paying attention to you. We then started to see much faster than usual claims of responsibility on the part of ISIS. It is unusual for ISIS to make a claim and to try and include the name of the attacker even before that's out on the media. So we, along with our colleagues around the world, will kind of be sorting through those claims today, trying to affix the level of credibility to them. But this was 2 hours after the actual shooting. Usually we see that 24 hours later. So one of the things we'll be sorting through is, was this a legitimate claim, or was it an attempt to claim it for a group that may or may not have had anything to do with it, or are their synapses firing faster in terms of their ability to use social media to do that? After that, we also saw things like fan art, people praising the attacks. We always see this after an attack. So now, how does that come home, aside from all that we do to look at that? And, you know, if you'd asked me on September 16th, what do I know about Ahmed Rahami, I might have said, you know, he shows up a couple of places in the databases. He was interviewed by Customs on the way back from a trip from Afghanistan. He was interviewed after a domestic violence incident in New Jersey where he allegedly made claims, where his father allegedly made claims that he was involved in terrorism. But those little pieces would not have been the thing that put him on the top of the radar at the NYPD Intelligence Bureau or the JTTF, because people against whom there was a lot more information, plotting attacks, discussing attacks, conspiring to do attacks, and at any one time there are 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 of those cases running, were the priorities we were following. But when that bomb went off at 8:30 in Chelsea, and we rushed to the scene that night, it was one of those things where you say, all right, we've been saying for a long time. In fact, Commissioner Bratton said it here at this podium prior to that bombing. It's not an if, it's a when. New York is always going to be a target. We'll stop most of the attacks, but, you know, one will get by, and that's what happened in Chelsea. The other thing that happened is as we responded to the bombing scene, we knew we had another live device just 4 blocks up the street. And I remember being in the command post and saying, well, we're going to get a lot of reports of suspicious packages. When something blows up, that's a natural thing. People spot things that they weren't paying attention to. We tell them if you see something, say something. They're going to call. So let's not get too excited. And then somebody from the scene called and said, you know, I'm looking at a pressure cooker on the street with a Samsung phone taped to the top of it and wires going inside. And I'm like, okay, so that's really bad. So I said to Andy, Sergeant McGinnis, there may be a bomb just 4 blocks from here. I'm probably needed in the command post. You should go up there. And Andy got there and he said, just like he said, boss, Samsung phone blinking on top of this pressure cooker. I said, well, all right, the bomb squad's probably going to separate that phone from the pressure cooker because we'll see what's in the pressure cooker later. But a Samsung phone, that's a 50% chance of blowing up all by itself. So that night unfolded, but what it told us was, well, it told us two things. One, in the years since 9/11, we have prevented or otherwise stopped, and there's a difference, 21 attacks plotted against New York City, or plots emerging from New York City to join terrorist groups or travel to foreign countries to do other attacks, and that this one had actually occurred. You could say if you take the Chelsea bombing or the Times Square truck bomb by Faisal Shahzad, those were two that flew under the radar. In the Faisal Shahzad case, he made a technical error and his bomb didn't blow up in Times Square, which is a good thing. In this case, destiny smiled on us, if not a higher power, and did not have large groups of people walking by that device when it functioned, because it would be roughly the equivalent to the device and recipe used in the Boston Marathon bombing. So we could have had multiple people dead, multiple people maimed, but we got by on that. Interestingly, Al-Qaeda later did a post-operational critique in their Inspire magazine of the Chelsea bombing and actually said that, it was the right day, Saturday, busy day, it was the right place, Chelsea, hot neighborhood, but it was the wrong placement. They said, you should not place your device next to a dumpster. And they went on to write that, people don't hang around by the dumpster. You should place it in a place where lots of people gather. So this wasn't a message to Ahmed Rahami. By then, he had been captured and was in custody. This was a message to the next Ahmed Rahami, which is this function of terrorism by mass marketing, control by remote control. You did a good job but not good enough. Here's for the next guy how to do better. And that's really disturbing to us that they have now done an after-action critique following the Nice truck attack, following the Rahami bombing, following the Pulse nightclub shooting, because they are trying to make the next attacker more effective.
My name is Abu Muslim.
Well, hang on a second. So this guy's name is Andrew Poulin. I want to play you like a 5 or 6 minute videotape, because when I look at these suspects and say they're living good lives in a great country, where does this impetus to kill strangers around you in a place you call home come from? And that's where ISIS has transcended Al-Qaeda's marketing plan. Al-Qaeda's marketing plan starts with, okay, you're Osama bin Laden, you sit down with John Miller, you declare war, you spend an hour, it goes on national television, and now your claim is out there. After that, they discovered YouTube and said, we don't have to go through the operational security risks of bringing in some guy from America or London and doing an interview. And we don't have to go through the media filter. So bin Laden would put out a 40-minute video. Zawahiri would put out a 45-minute tape. Adam Gadam, their American voice, the kid from California, would do another. And these were less than inspiring, I think, for a lot of people. Anwar al-Awlaki broke the mold because he was a guy who actually had charisma and would connect with people. In 2009, 2010, if you took the dozen plots that we had in the United States and you sat them all down, including the Times Square bomber, and you said, what got you here? 9 of them said it was after viewing the videotapes of Anwar al-Awlaki. So we knew he was compelling. But when you look at marketing, and that's what a lot of this is. I mean, it's dark, it's dangerous, it's deadly, but it's marketing. When they recruit for the Marines, the Commandant of the Marine Corps does not come on and say, we need you. When they recruit for the Army or the Air Force, they don't show the Secretary of Defense or the Chief of Staff. They show the soldiers, they show the sailors, they show the pilots doing what they do in these great heroic moments. And they say, be all you can be. They say, the few, the brave, the chosen. I mean, they have their slogans, but it's Al-Qaeda's mistake, I think, in terms of drawing people in was they made it about me, the boss, the leader, the head. They didn't make it about you, the fighter, the soldier, the believer. ISIS broke that mold. I look at all these videos, and I can't remember seeing a Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi video saying, I'm the head of ISIS and this is our message. We get texts and sometimes an audio from Sheikh Adnani, who was their chief communicator, but their films are meant to come with a certain promise. And I wanted to show you this one because it's like a lot of their films, but it has a story arc. If you sat down in Hollywood and said, what's a story arc? It's boy meets girl, boy gets girl, boy loses girl, gets girl. This is, here's a guy struggling to fit in, but he doesn't. He doesn't have a cause. His life doesn't have meaning. Then it tells you he finds a calling, and it brings him to something that is bigger than himself, where he achieves belonging. And then it says, and it calls on him to be empowered and to sacrifice. And he goes on. So it's part newscast, it's part travelogue, it's part biography, it's part war film, but it is the kind of thing that has enormous appeal. So what I'd like to do is just run through it for you and picture yourself as you're 22, you're living in your parents' basement bedroom because they turned your room into a den, but then you flunked out of school, and you're not making it work, and your social circle has drifted away because they're all on to other things. Maybe they're making it. You might be estranged from your family, and you are not feeling like a hero. You are not feeling empowered. You are not feeling a part of something bigger. You're not even feeling a part of something smaller. And you go searching for, what is that thing that could give me valor and belonging and empowerment? And, you see a product like this.
My name is Abu Muslim. I'm your brother in Islam here in Syria. I originally come from Canada.
يا فوز من نال الشهادة صادقا تمحى الذنوب إذا الدماء تقطر وإذا الزهور تعطرت.
Before Islam, I was like any other regular Canadian. I watched hockey. I went to the cottage in the summertime. I loved to fish. I wanted to go hunting. I liked outdoors. I liked sports.
تعمر ولهم منازل في الجنان وصحبة ومعين خيرات يزيد ويكثر.
I was like your everyday regular Canadian before Islam. Then, alhamdulillah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guided me from the darkness of kufr to the light of Iman, to Islam.
ولا في فتنة بالقبر لا لن يسألوا أو يقهروا ما تمنى.
Before I come here to Syria, I had money, I had a family, I had good friends, I had colleagues. I worked as a street janitor. I made over $2,000 a month at this job. It was a very good job. It was a very good job. And, even though I wasn't rich beyond my wildest imaginations, I was making it. It was good. And, I always had family to support me, and I had friends to support me. So it's not like I was some social outcast. It wasn't like I was some anarchist or somebody who just wants to destroy the world and kill everybody. No, I was a regular person. And, mujahideen are regular people too. We get married, we have families, we have lives, we have lives just like any other soldier in any other army. This means more than just fighting. We need the engineers, we need doctors, we need professionals, we need volunteers, we need fundraising, we need everything. There's a role for everybody. Every person can contribute something to the Islamic State. Your families would live here in safety just like how it is back home. We have wide expanses of territory here in Syria, and we can easily find accommodation for you and your families.
Abu Muslim was from the few, of the few, of the few. He accepted Islam in a land at war with Islam, in a land with few Muslims, in a land where evil, kufr and sin called him from every direction and corner to succumb to shaitan and to his desires. He accepted Islam, learned his religion, practiced it, called others to it, and did not stop there. He was tested with hardship and imprisonment. Yet he was patient and firm, in contrast with those who change at the first sign of tribulation. When he was released by Allah's grace and heard of the jihad in Ash-Sham, he rushed to perform hijrah despite all the opposition from the enemies of Allah and their intelligence agencies. He married in Ash-Sham, but did not allow his marriage, nor the child he was expecting, to deter him from his commitment to his Lord. He eagerly pledged allegiance to the Islamic State, seeking to play a role in reviving the Khilafah, until he witnessed the battle for the military airport of Minnir. On that day, he rushed into the airport, hoping to meet his Lord and gain closeness to him. He was a brother with excellent character, truthfulness, dedication, selflessness, and steadfastness. We consider him such, and Allah is his judge.
وتمشطت دون العظام لحومهم وعلى المفارق في الروح.
He moved during the battle like a man who did not know death. Rather, he knew that true life awaited him, and it was only a matter of being struck down by the weapons of the kuffar. He was a brother who would be pleased with the bare minimum and still shine with happiness. And thus his Lord had decreed an appointment for their meeting, so he answered the call of his Lord and surrendered his soul without hesitation, leaving the world behind him, not out of despair and hopelessness, but rather with certainty of Allah's promise.
And I myself, I'm a convert of only 6 years. MashaAllah, you brothers were born into Islam. You have a Muslim family. You have this Muslim upbringing. It's a big ni'mat from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a big gift. MashaAllah, you should be very grateful for it. And you probably know Islam better than me even. Maybe you have studied and you know Sahih Bukhari and you are Hafidh al-Quran and you know Arabic very well and you have all this knowledge. So apply this knowledge into your life. Put Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala before your family, put it before yourself, put it before everything. Put Allah before everything. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward you.
And then, like anything else, the credits roll after the logo. So this is fairly sophisticated production when you compare it to, Bin Laden setting up a camera and doing a half-hour spiel about join the fight. It has a lot of psychological appeal. On the other end of this in New York, we feel the result of that appeal. I go back to the spring of 2015 when, we had an individual on Twitter named Abu al-Bratani. He turned out to be a guy in Raqqa whose true name was Junaid Hussain, but he was tweeting to a couple of guys in Phoenix. His main message was, gone are the days when you have to attend a terrorist training camp or travel to the battlefront. We can give you everything you need online. And he was the individual who exchanged 109 messages, not on Twitter, but when he moved them to an encrypted platform with the two guys who became the Garland, Texas shooters. After that in New York City, he communicated with 3 individuals in Queens and in Staten Island who plotted to build pressure cooker bombs to put in the crowds during the 4th of July fireworks. He communicated with 3 individuals up in New England who were going to drive down here and commit a kidnapping of a named individual and behead her and record it on GoPro video. He communicated with a lot of people until he stopped communicating, which is a different result. But what we saw was several levels of this. The broader advertising to bring people into the discussion. The direct contact using regular social media channels, which really is a game changer, because it's one thing to watch the commercial. It's another thing to be talking to the salesman who's giving you the pitch about that could be you. And then the third thing, and this is part of the going dark, it used to be going dark, now we are dark phenomenon of then, so from mass marketing advertising to standard social media, Twitter, to encrypted channels where they could talk on free apps, you know, that any of us can download to our phone that were impenetrable, even with, you know, judicial process and court orders, which is why, to this day, we still don't know what the 109 messages between Junaid Hussain and the Garland, Texas shooters say. We have a pretty good guess, but we don't know. That translated in New York to people who accepted this kind of propaganda, whether it was the old Ammar al-Awlaki videos or the new products put out by ISIS. So we had the 2 women in Queens who were plotting to build pressure cooker bombs and asking an undercover detective from the NYPD to obtain the al-Qaeda instructions from Inspire magazine for them, or what followed with Junaid Hussain, those other plots, or the case involving Ahmed Sajmir, who, while he was trying to leave his residence in the Bronx to travel to join ISIS, in the background, you know, the things he was ordering to be delivered to his home, large tactical knives and flex ties that you could use to handcuff people, gave us a real signal that he might be following the prescription, which is if you cannot come here and fight, stay home and fight there. Or the case of Mohammed Rafiq Naji, who had tried on other occasions to travel to join ISIS, was living right here in New York City, and there was a risk of him following, based on his discussions, the same path. What became more problematic was the September 20th, 2014 message from ISIS, from Sheikh Adnani, which is, come here and fight with us, and if you can't, fight for us where you are, was altered right before the Pulse nightclub shooting. They decided, A, we're getting pounded here. B, the fighters who come unprepared from the West are a little soft and don't do us that much good. We'd rather get people from the region who've been around a little more war. So the message Sheikh Adnani sent was twofold. One, do not come here and fight with us on the battlefield. The smallest thing you do where you live in the West is bigger than the biggest thing you would do here with us. So that was a shift, which basically put the onus on somebody who bought this narrative to say, you need to do something here. Right after that message, we saw a rapid-fire series of attacks, German train stabbings, attacks on police officers in France, the Pulse nightclub shooting. So it was clear that that message had not just gotten through, but with granularity, because the next thing we saw was the phenomenon we call dying live, which is Adnani's instructions further said, while you're doing the attack, since we don't know you and you don't know us, make sure that you claim responsibility for ISIS during the attack. And so Omar Mateen in Orlando, after his first volley of gunfire, killing numerous people, barricades himself and calls 911. And she says, what's your emergency? And he says, I'm the shooter in the Pulse nightclub. And she says, what's your name? He said, what's my name? My name is I pledge allegiance to Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in the Islamic State. Because he knew this is a recorded line. It's a Sunshine State. They released those calls to the media, and he had to lay down that mark. The individual who killed a French police captain and his wife live streamed on his Facebook page during the slaughter before a SWAT team entered and took him out before he could. What he was debating on his Facebook page was what to do with their 3-year-old child. So again and again and again, we've seen these claims of credit which follow the doctrine, which is attack where you are, and make sure you lay down a marker for us, and make sure you do it before or during what you see, which largely fits into the theme we saw yesterday, which was a claim of responsibility within 2 hours of an international attack, if we vet our way through this, possibly coming through the headquarters of the organization that orders it. All of that is why in New York City we have the Counterterrorism Bureau. Those are the people you see facing outward. Those are the people with long guns in Times Square. They're the ones guarding the sensitive locations. They're the people who shift around every day based on whatever the threat stream or intelligence is that day. And we work on that all overnight. It's why, and I see Jonathan Dienst here, who did the story on NBC, why we have those officers stationed now in 14 countries, liaising with their police agencies so that when something happens, our guy in Paris can say, this is what we have. He can run it against our guy in Europol, who can say, this is what everybody else has, who can run its traps against the detective we have sitting in Interpol, who can say, this is what the whole world has. And all of those fragments, come to the Intel operations desk in New York, where we start to piece them together and say, all right, first thing we're looking for is, where's the New York piece of this puzzle? Second thing they're looking for is, does any of this come together in a way that we can help the Joint Terrorism Task Force and the FBI or our partners overseas? And that is just a machine that runs all the time. The JTTF is the key to all of this. Our partnership with the FBI, which hasn't always been perfect through its history, which goes back to 1980, is right now as strong, as close, as seamless as it has ever been. Over 100 NYPD detectives are on that Joint Terrorism Task Force. And the work of the Intelligence Bureau, which in every one of these cases that has been prosecuted, whether it's a JTTF case or an NYPD case, there is a factor that the Intelligence Bureau brings to that, whether it's the undercover officer, a specific human source, a piece of information, a technology, a foreign partnership. And this is all bound together in a system that has been built very carefully in the years since 9/11 to take the safest big city in America from crime and make sure that it's also the best protected city in America, if not the world, from terrorism. That would be a good place to stop, and I'll turn it over to Commissioner Sandler.
Thank you. That was very sobering. I'm glad you did show the video. We have microphones. People can come and ask questions. Let me just say before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge Stanley Schuman at the table here. He's our chair of our advisory committee for the Center for New York City Law and has been from the very beginning. And thank you for being here. And for Dick Condon, former New York City Police Commissioner. Thank you for being here. So let's... normally we would start with Bart Schwartz, but unfortunately he's not here. I just received notice that he was removed from an airplane, not alone. The entire group was left off, so he wasn't able to get here. So he's not a terrorist. And so Bart, if you're listening, we miss you. So let's start over here.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Moore. I'm from Princeton University. I wanted to ask, as you mentioned, social media, and I wanted to ask if there is a dialogue between police or counterterrorism institutions with private organizations such as Facebook, Twitter, and so on regarding these kind of interface of how you can work, how you can do counterterrorism with social networks.
So that's been an ongoing dialogue and perhaps our most imperfect work in that as we've seen the terrorism narrative get better and better, more sophisticated, more effective, the counter narrative in the same social media channels has never emerged effectively. So, when you talk to an outfit like Google and you ask a question, when somebody puts in a Google search that would bring up the video that we just saw, how do I join ISIS, what are the reasons for jihad, whatever the question is, if there was a counter-narrative to that, could that pop up underneath or on top? at the same time in the same search? And, the answer we get back from the big providers is maybe. I mean, it's not computationally impossible, but where's the product? And we don't have it. So as kind of the media capital of the world, the advertising capital of the world, the most sophisticated communicators maybe of the world, and I mean not just New York, but the United States, this long after 9/11, we're still failing on figuring out what that message should be and who the messenger of it should be and how to be effective on it. But we're still struggling with that. Government is probably the worst person to be the formulator of the message and the absolute wrong person to be the messenger. So it's about getting people to step up.
Go to this side.
John, you need to help me maintain law and order at City Hall, aka the Bingo Hall, former home to ECW. You need to help me maintain law and order on Parade Day. You need to help me maintain law and order in the Times Square section on December 31.
Okay. So, Mr. Stanford, you actually hit the bullseye because City Hall security falls under the Intelligence Bureau. And, the security we provide beyond City Hall for different public events, demonstrations, and so on, falls under patrol, but we help manage that. And as for Times Square on December 31st, that's a plan in a box because we do New Year's Eve every year, but the counterterrorism overlay piece of that, since we go from bombing attacks to active shooter scenarios to now ramming crowds with trucks, is something that we tweak and adjust year after year after year. And it doesn't get smaller because when you go into a new strain of what those plans looks like, you don't get to drop, the last one because those threats are still there. So that's an ongoing process that never stops on both counts.
Let's go to this side.
Fine.
Tom McShane from Guidepost, standing in for Bart Schwartz this morning. Always a dangerous thing.
I had to stop an airplane and pull off 200 passengers
yeah.
to avoid the Bart Shorts question, which I thought was not fair to all those other people.
Yeah.
And you're going to do this anyway.
That's right. Yeah, we're still waiting for the full report on Bart coming through. Just two questions. Number one, I wonder if you have a view that you could share with respect to the urgency or efficacy of the travel bans that have been proposed by the Trump administration, number one. And number two, I wonder if the Trump administration has consulted with you and your experts regarding your views regarding those issues and the urgency of those proposed travel bans.
Well, the first thing I like to do as a police official who receives over $180 million of federal counterterrorism funds is dive into political questions and third rails. The second thing I like to do is, Bart had a plan, clearly. The second thing I like to do is try and kind of zoom back from the politics of it and go down to the disconnected from the emotional hot wire mechanics of it. And I think when you look at the travel ban and the increased vetting, it was confusing to me when it came out because I was familiar with the vetting we were already doing from countries of higher interest in terms of the counterterrorism field and people, how long the vetting took, how deep the vetting went, the work of USCIS and running those names against assorted government databases to look for any connection to terrorism. So I wasn't positive after a quick review of the travel ban requirements what the difference was, except that it might take longer, but they seem to be running all the traps they had to run in the first place. So I'm not sure how much of that was politics and campaign promises and press releases as opposed to actual substantive differences. I do know, and I say this also not politically, it created a lot of fear, a lot of angst, a lot of worry, and still does, in immigrant communities across the country. And in a city of immigrants like New York, as the police department, we have had to work double time to reassure those communities that we're the police. You call us when you need help. You call us when you're the victim of a crime. You call us when you're a witness to a crime. But you will never have to worry about the New York City Police Department asking, what is your immigration status? And I think we've had to reinforce that message a lot, because whether it's the ability to provide police service, the ability to move people to other services, or if we zero in on my area, the confidence people have to come forward and say, I may have some information about a terrorist plot, but I'm afraid to go to the police because they may ask if I'm here legally. We've had to do a lot to counter that anxiety.
Morning, sir. My name's Mike Kelvington. I'm an Army officer going to Princeton right now, working on an MPA. My question is if you could speak to either whether you believe the term lone wolf is true, or if it's more of something that you see pop up on news reports and everything that may not necessarily be true. So you have Director Comey that likes to call them stray or lone rats. You have Brian Michael Jenkins that calls them stray dogs. But I think a lot of these recent things, especially when you peel the onion back on people in the groups like the Legion, it's really much more than that. And so there's this false propagation that happens where they're labeled lone wolves, but in fact, I think the question that should be asked first is who else is involved?
So we've seen pure lone wolves. But Mike, we've also seen things that we assumed were lone wolves based on a fairly long pattern. When you look at ISIS attacks through Western Europe, and as the intelligence pieces have emerged to add more clarity to those pictures, we found out that some of them were connected to each other. More of them were connected to an individual manager who were directing their actions. So you can kind of get tied up in, well, they weren't lone wolves. They were part of an ongoing network, and they were misread. I actually try not to get caught up in the terminology. You know, Comey's point of calling them lone rats is just calling them lone wolves is an insult to wolves. But the idea of getting caught up in the labels in my job is I'm very interested in whether they were alone or working together with others, but I'm not very interested in, you know, the doctrine of the labels because it becomes a distraction. I just want to know who are they, where are they, are we on them if they're planning to do bad things to good people, and do we have the ability to either have enough intelligence to interdict that with a conversation, disrupt it with an arrest for some other crime, or carry that thread forward so we can learn more about the network if there is one. And those are decisions that we make at the early stages of any case.
Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Martin Hollowell here. I live a few blocks from where the buildings were taken down. Maybe not an NYPD question. I've read about at 9/11 the computerized airline passenger profiling system that flagged half of the hijackers at 9/11. Are we doing anything different? You know, the Milwaukee people said we have suspicious activity here. We have people who overstay their visas. Not an NYPD question. Thank you.
So I think we're doing everything differently. The baseline from what we did before 9/11, where there were a dozen disparate watch lists that didn't speak to each other, had some of the same people, many different people. Richard, where are you going? I'm not done. This is about billable hours, right? You have to just crank it down. So after 9/11, those lists were all centralized. So now you have the TSDB, which is the terrorist database. You've got TIDE, which is the Terrorist Identities Data Mart Environment. Clearly somebody was smoking in the acronym unit that day. But part of what we were talking about before with vetting people who come over is, you know, they're run against those databases connect, they deconflict, they speak to each other. So that's been a big improvement. Visa overstays, that's something that is handled by the Department of Homeland Security, and, you know, that's, in a terrorism case, that's a potential advantage. In most cases, it's something else.
Good morning. Shannon Lashley from City Law at New York Law School. Mr. Miller, thank you so much for your hard work and your perseverance. I'm curious, since you brought up your Google search, I didn't see exactly where you were educated formally. I see that you did counterterrorism work at Harvard and training sessions there and Columbia. So beyond your journalism experience and your public relations experience, I'm curious to know what your qualifications are.
So I have a near 8-year formal education. That would be the 6 years in high school and the 1 year in college. You know, if I just pick up that other year, I could ball that whole thing up. You know, when I was 14 years old, I started working in the newsroom. When I was 18 years old, I was a reporter on the street and did that for 25 years. And most of my learning has been in the college of doing it.
Let me ask a question about the lone wolf. The lone wolf metaphor seems to be a person who spontaneously does something and can't be identified, but your discussion in the video showed that there was really a strong connection, and I wonder if the term lone wolf is really a bad term and really shouldn't be used.
I mean, when we use the term lone wolf, we talk about somebody who is self-generating the plot, gathering the weapons, making the plan, and then acting on their own, but directed by a message. That is how I would kind of categorize the lone wolf. But the organization, particularly ISIS, has kind of broken that model because, and I don't want to fall down this rabbit hole, but you could get into a real debate as to whether someone who goes through all that material and says, I'm with them, is a lone wolf, or is he a part of the organization, even if they never met? Junaid Hussain, or Abu al-Britani's core message was, you can be a part of this without us ever shaking hands. If you look at the attack from yesterday, they usually said so-and-so was a soldier of the Islamic State. You know, yesterday I think they referred to him as an ISIS fighter. You know, so they're making that connection possibly more directly. We're still analyzing that.
These would be the last two questions.
Good morning, Commissioner. Just a couple quick questions and points. You mentioned the NYPD's International Liaison Program, and my understanding is a large part of that's funded through the NYPD Foundation.
That's right.
Would it be beneficial for that to have a normal operating process and come more under the City Council's oversight or civilian oversight? And I know there was some, reason why I mentioned this, I know there were some incidents in Mumbai and in London with regards to issues with local law enforcement in both countries. The second point was with regards to Orlando. The gentleman who perpetrated those acts claimed allegiance to ISIS and Hezbollah, from my understanding. And that's like someone during the Troubles claiming allegiance to the IRA and to the British government. So could you provide some clarification on that? And just lastly, there's a mention of...
These are the last two questions, starting with the last three.
Last part. Last part. Are there any non-Muslim related issues with regards to counterterrorism or intelligence that your work involves, because the presentation today only involved ISIS-related matters? Thank you.
Right. So trying to remember my way through the set. But the Foreign Liaison Program is paid for by the NYPD because 85%, 90% of the costs are personnel costs, the salaries, the overtime, so on. It's the travel, getting them situated, that's paid for by the Police Foundation, which is the smaller cost, but it gives us great flexibility. I mean, in the course of a year, I might move one post from another place to another place. Once you get into the city council bureaucracy, you know, the ability to only make moves from one fiscal year to another and to have to plan 2 fiscal years out can limit flexibility, not in every case. But the Police Foundation embraced this program early. Would I spend $100,000 on in terms of, you know, shelter and logistics? The federal government would spend $750,000 on. So government isn't always the most efficient answer. The second thing was...
The Pulse night bomb.
So the Pulse nightclub bombing. That's more common than you would think. If you go back to the Charlie Hebdo attacks, those guys said, we're with the Islamic State. But then the guy who said, I'm with them, and did the Jewish delicatessen hostage siege said, I'm with Al-Qaeda, but we're together. And at that time, Al-Qaeda and ISIS were fighting. So when the Pulse nightclub guy says, I'm with Hezbollah, I'm with Al-Qaeda, I'm with ISIS, here's a guy who you have to examine. Was his motive purely violence? And the doctrine became, I need a narrative to say why I'm doing this. Was he just an active shooter, like you would see in a, that we would just chalk up to an emotionally disturbed person, or was he a committed terrorist? He seemed to be confused about what he was committed to, but he was certainly committed to killing. So I don't dwell too much on that. He probably looked at everybody's propaganda. And what was the last thing? Non-Muslim. So in the Intelligence Bureau, as opposed to the Detective Bureau, we're about 40% counterterrorism cases, 60% criminal work. A piece of those counterterrorism cases goes to white extremist groups, sovereign groups, Moorish groups, any group that is advocating or promoting hate crimes or violence will be on our radar. The Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Hezbollah piece, and I'm allowed to cross those lines because on the enforcement side, it's not about doctrine, it's about are they planning to hurt people. That takes up the majority of our bandwidth because that makes up most of the cases we see where people are plotting and planning. We've had a couple of straight up all-American extremists that we've taken down, but statistically it's a smaller number.
Steve Cohen, New York Observer editorial board. To make New York safer, to do your job better, what authorizations, resources, initiatives are at the top of your list?
I think the going dark problem, so let me back through that. What we do in the Intelligence Bureau is guided by the Handschuh rules. This comes out of a consent decree that dates back to the 80s in a hard-fought case that really spawns out of intelligence tracking of groups, involved in protests around the Vietnam War. We embraced it as the set of rules we use in counterterrorism because the Handschuh rules look a lot like the Attorney General guidelines. So it aligns us in many ways with we operate against terrorists the way the FBI does. And since our cases cross over, using the same rule book is actually helpful because when it goes from being a city case to a federal case, we don't have a large disparity of things we do. A lot of people chafe at that. I believe that if, my good friend John Timoney always said, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. And I said, that's not really original. He said, I'm not done. And those who study policing know we don't study history. What I take from that is, we seem to lurch from the same scandals every 20 years to the next iteration of the same thing and, where are the lessons learned? So coming into the LAPD Intelligence Bureau or the NYPD Intelligence Bureau, first thing I do is study history, which is the FBI came under the rules it's under today because of the COINTELPRO scandal, where they operated as collection intelligence operators without rules. The LAPD had the PDID scandal, which gave them their own set of rules and consent decrees and lawsuits that dictated how we operated when I ran that program. The NYPD under the Handschuh Agreement. So wherever you go in the intelligence field, you see first they decided to start the secret agent program, then they got in a lot of trouble, and then they were managed by a strict set of rules. So I think the rules are our friend because it gives us a standard to go by that is not left solely up to our own judgment, but it also gives us a set of rules so when we are questioned, why did you do this, how could you do that, we can go back to the rules and say, we went by these rules. So I think that's great. So that's what we have that I don't want to get rid of. In fact, in a recent settlement with a number of plaintiffs suing the Intelligence Bureau for the alleged Muslim spying program, we laid out what we do and how we do it. And the plaintiffs in large measure said, well, if you're doing it that way, you're actually exceeding what is required by the rules. And in finding our way to a settlement, they said, well, could you codify the way you actually do it which exceeds the rules, into the rules. And we said, well, since we're doing it that way, why not? So that's what I'm not trying to get rid of. I'm not looking for less rules based on what we have now, which I think is reasonable and effective. The real problem we face goes back to the going dark issue, which is we, not the police department, not the FBI, not the DA, but we as a country, and then we as a global community have to sort out, do we want to operate in a way where I can get a court order from a federal judge or a New York State Supreme Court justice and go into a vault, into a safe deposit box, into a car, into anything. But when I'm in the middle of a kidnapping case and a child is being held and we grab, my Apple iPhone 7 and say to the guy who just picked up the ransom, what's the code to get into this phone? And he says, no, I can't get a court order that says Apple can open it. I can't get into that encrypted app that was used to control the Garland, Texas shooters. I can't access the communications of the terrorists that I know we have on the ground here who are communicating. It doesn't mean that if we can't listen in on their devices or crack their apps, we can't crack the case. There are other ways to do it. But when those other ways don't work after the fact, when you're kind of doing the autopsy going backwards about how did this happen and why, you see the lost opportunities are there. So the conversation has to be between the people in Congress about, you should never sit down in a conversation where you say, how much liberty am I willing to trade for security? Part of having liberty is being able to talk to your electeds and saying, this is the way I want it. And people have to decide how they want it, because as our ability to use legal process to intercept communications from criminal and terrorist organizations is narrowing, as that artery is getting tighter and tighter, there will be results from that, and we will accept some of that responsibility. But we can't accept all of it if we've made the collective decision that, that privacy that exceeds a court's ability to interrupt it for good cause is an absolute.
Thank you. This was, stay here. Let me just say, we have never had a more important talk here in this podium.
I was going to say that.
And I do want to thank you. It was sobering, informative, and a lot to think about and take away. Before you all leave, I do want to just acknowledge one other person here, Ari Moss, who is on leave from the police department and is teaching at Woodrow Wilson and brought many students with him here today, which is why you got a question from Princeton. Thank you. As we always do with our speakers, we like to give a product of the scholarship of this law school, and this is a book by my colleague David Schoenbrod, D.C. Confidential, Inside the 5 Tricks of Washington. Maybe it'll be good for the police department. And we give it to you with thanks again for a morning that I think we'll all take away with us, as we have learned a lot, heard a lot, and there's more to do in this area. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
That was terrific.